Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Thank you. All right. We have our two panelists today. We have Alejandro Garcia-Tunon, and then we also have Michael Edelnant. All right. It's nice to see everyone. Thank you all for attending live in person, and then also to our online audience outside in the Streamland. Today is our Tech Tuesday panel, and we're going to talk today about UI and UX for gaming, user interface and user experience. My name is Dr. Rebecca Leis. My title is that I'm a program director for the Computer Science Bachelor's Program and the User Experience Bachelor's Program as well, and a couple other programs here, Computer Science Masters, a whole bunch of other ones. For everyone here, we're going to be streaming this live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and then we will also have it available later as well. So let's get into our panel. I'm going to have each one of our panelists kind of do a little bit of an introduction of their own, talk a little bit about their background. All right, if you want to go ahead.
Sure.
Alejandro.
I'm Alejandro Garcia-Tunon. I'm the Director of Technology at Ghostpunch Games. I started out in military simulation back in 2005, but I pretty quickly went into the game industry, starting at Vicarious Visions. Then I worked at a studio in South Florida called Darkside Game Studios, where I was the lead programmer, and I worked at Magic Leap as the head of technology operations for Magic Leap Studios, which was like the game development department of Magic Leap. And I joined Ghostpunch as a partner at the beginning of 2019. And so we started out, it was 5 employees, and we're approaching 50 at this point.
All right, fantastic. Cool. What about you, Michael?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Michael Edelnant. I graduated 2005. Digital media, and then I also graduated 2015 in mobile development. Let's see here. After I graduated 2005, I actually worked for Full Sail. I was a front-end dev working on FullSail.com, along with like LA recording schools and LA film. And so I was able to contribute a lot in terms of the development there. But eventually I was recruited into AAA gaming by EA, and so I worked on Madden 08. I was lead interface designer for NFL Tour. After that, I worked in sports for about 6 or 8 years or so, and so I was actually building fantasy game experiences, second screen experiences, working with teams for scouting analysis tools, and it was really rewarding work in terms of just kind of seeing how some of these teams were able to use the tools that I was creating with other people, of course, but actually ending up in positive results for their performance. And so I eventually got out of sports and got back into gaming. And so I worked on Madden 21, Madden 20. I've also worked in Web3 and crypto space as well, with the last title that I worked on was just Photo Finish Live. And yeah, that's quite a bit, but happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. So now we're going to go into our questions. First question is, what are some of the best practices for designing user interfaces in games? All right.
So I can't speak to design too much. I always come from a technical perspective, but when you're developing something for consoles, the Nintendo Switch or PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, there is a set of documents that define technical requirements for those platforms. And so my recommendation always to a UI designer is from the very beginning, look at those technical requirements, because it's going to inform the rest of it. And it's simple things like respecting screen space, so you can't put stuff right at the edges, and no overlapping text, and no blank screens for X amount of time, so you can't have a blank screen for longer than 30 seconds or whatever the number is. So it's just understanding those technical requirements of the platform that you're going to before or while considering the design process at the beginning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry about that. So yeah, from the technical requirements, when we talk about my experience with mobile gaming in particular, there's human interface guidelines, and so there's those tech requirements as well that we try to abide by. But when we're using tools like Unity to go ahead and actually have one code base that we can distribute across multiple platforms, some of that goes out the window a little bit. That said, what we try to do is make sure that we provide user agency, that the interface is intuitive. So onboarding is critical when we're introducing that user to the game experience. But then there's also ensuring retention and funneling the user to make sure that we hit that core loop in terms of the game experience as well.
Fantastic. All right, so next question is, how can we make sure the user experience is consistent across different platforms and devices?
Okay, so I could definitely touch on that. So in terms of the user, so every platform is uniquely different. And so the thing is, I don't think that there's one particular UX that works across the board. And we were talking about this earlier, so how Alejandro touched on that. That said, I think there's certain consistencies or cohesiveness that we could aim for. So in particular, when we were working on Madden, we're working on next gen along with current gen, but we're also working on PC as well. And so it's the same UI that transcends across, but we're just going ahead and binding it to different inputs. And so some of that gets lost in translation in terms of the user experience, but then we try to go ahead and fill those gaps with prompting and hinting and anything else we can do to kind of assist.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that happened in like early mobile days was when trying to port or core game experiences into a handheld or a mobile space is kind of the virtual analog sticks, right?
Yep.
And that we found pretty quickly was a mistake. Right? It doesn't translate directly. That UI just does not translate directly. So it's like it became a lesson of like finding the right experience for the platform that you are developing on or using.
Definitely. And that's the thing too, is like we're kind of seeing this emergence of, or not emergence, but we got VR, we have AR, and so there's this whole new introduction into how do we go ahead and actually build those user interfaces for those experiences as well, and it's not necessarily a one-to-one. So there's a lot to be taken into account there.
Yeah, trying to find a complementary UI, UX across devices versus competitive, right? Okay, so next question is, what are some of the effective methods for collecting data on user experiences in games?
So from my experience, a lot of the collection was about transitions, inputs, basically understanding what the player is doing. What buttons do they click? How much time do they spend on a single screen? And all that stuff gets collated and sent to a database. I can't speak much to the analysis of that data. I was always just collecting the data. I don't know if you have any insight into.
Yeah, no, I could definitely touch on that. I think before we get to the telemetry in game, though, there's a lot of just research that's done beforehand, and so we're doing a lot of competitive analysis and everything else. But then from there, can we touch on the question one more time?
Sure. Sorry. What are some effective methods for collecting data on user experiences?
So through those focus groups and being able to do diary studies, so we're testing gameplay, we're testing retention. The biggest thing at the end of the day is making sure building a game can sometimes actually be quite easy once you get up to launch. I think a lot of the hard work is done on the retention side of things, especially in a live ops or mobile game strategy. And so then being able to work with the hooks that Alejandro was talking about, we're able to go ahead and then take that data and make informed decisions and iterate on the experience based off of what we're seeing. So when we're looking at DAU versus MAU, so daily average user versus monthly average user, cost per install, ARPDAU, those are all metrics that a lot of companies look at to make a determination if this game is successful. And so it's important in terms of the user interface that we're working cross-functionally with all teams to make sure that we are hitting those milestones. Well, not milestones, but we're moving the needle in the right direction as to where we need to get.
All right.
So yeah, one of the things that I always found interesting during development as well was when deciding what data to collect. because usually it's the more data, the better. You can find out more. But really the point of the data is not the data itself, but it's the ability to answer questions. And so you oftentimes want to know those questions ahead of time. And sometimes you don't know those questions ahead of time. So it's always finding that line of like, do you collect more data and then figure out the questions later? Or do you know the questions ahead of time and only implement that data, but possibly miss out on, missed opportunity on information you could have had? There's also like a non-zero cost to the analysis part of it, to converting data once it's in the database and cleaning it up. So I don't think there's a single easy answer to that, and you just kind of got to figure out what works with the resources that you have and the questions that you need to answer.
Yeah, and to touch on that too, just a little bit more is when we talk about focus groups, there's different kinds of focus groups. We could bring them in and actually go ahead and interact with them, provide them a scripted test. But there's also the social platforms too, and then there's Discord. So on the last title that I was working on, we had a direct channel with the Discord community, and we were building the game in real time with them. And there's something to be said there, because once the player realizes that they have a direct tie to those who are creating the game, it just creates that loyalty, and then they go ahead and actually want to contribute more. And so that feedback is critical to our success, ensuring that we're making a super fun experience that isn't as frustrating as it can be.
So kind of going off that a little bit, how can any kind of game developer or designer or anybody take feedback and implement it back into their game? Like, what is that process like, and what is good feedback versus bad feedback, and like, how do you determine which things to bring back into your game?
Yes.
No, honestly, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to answer, because I don't know that there is a way to do it. It's understanding the product, I think, understanding what you want the user to experience, and so it's going to be different. It's going to be different every time. And part of that analysis is understand. Like you mentioned, what is good data? Just because someone answers a survey and said, this is wrong with this should be this, that doesn't mean that's actually true. Maybe it was a one-off experience, or maybe that person was having a bad day, or maybe, any number of factors could have contributed to that data point. And so you need to understand, is it consistent over time? Is it, there's so many variables that can go into that there's just no one good answer to it.
I'm still thinking. That's the thing. Alejandro's on point. Like it's different and depending on the context. But for us, I could definitely talk to Photo Finish Live. It was just one of those things where we were able to gauge player sentiment quickly through those channels, and they were able to go ahead and voice their frustrations. So we would be able to prioritize certain hot patches or fixes, or hot fixes, I mean. We'd have it rolled out in a day or two. And so then we could go ahead and alleviate that frustration, and then we get some positive sentiment, and then we could go ahead and continue on working on our new features while also handling bugs.
So we were talking about AI tools before we walked out on stage. Do
Yes.
you use any kind of AI tools like sentiment analysis, natural language processing when you're collecting feedback, or do you use AI tools in different ways?
So I've been experimenting with AI in many different ways. So like I've been working with ChatGPT for a little bit about a month and a half, 2 months, give or take. But I've also been exploring with like other AI tools. So when I'm looking for questions to ask in a survey, like in foundational questions, I'll go to ChatGPT and say, hey, in this context, for this type of game, what questions are best for an onboarding survey? But there's other AI tools that are quite scary. And so, like, in terms of UI-Zard, Galileo AI, there's a few that can generate user interface. And so then you get into question, like, why are we learning how to do design? Because if we have AI that could go ahead and generate design based off these prompts, or existing user interfaces and building additional screens that are derived from that user interface, I'm getting to a good point here. So the thing is, at first, I was thinking to myself, well, I'm going to be jobless in about a year or two. But then I started to realize that it actually makes my job easier for myself. It allows me to ideate. It allows me to conceptualize quicker. And so some folks don't have the affordability of working with large teams, but we still have to deliver similar expectations. And so it gives us the ability to deliver on that. I'm thankful for it.
So, but if you take it one step deeper, yeah, I mean, it is making your job easier, and it might put some people out of a job, right? Because it is making individuals more efficient. But if you think about it, the AI is not reasoning itself to that conclusion, right? It's using a data set that was previously generated by people who did reason to that conclusion.
Precedents, yeah.
Right? So if you're only ever using AI to generate new content, there's going to be no new content.
Right.
Because it's only using what's out there, with some variations and mutations and everything. But real innovation, I think, is still it's going to have to happen with people.
I definitely agree. And in terms of I spoke on the UXR panel earlier this morning too, but in terms of that research and being able to take a look at that qualitative versus quantitative data, it really does help to have that human approach and being able to go ahead and make informed decisions based off that.
Fantastic. Okay. So next question is, how can we design the user interface to be accessible to players with disabilities?
So there's a lot that gets taken into account there, and so the thing is like when we talk about accessibility and disabilities, there's so many. The first that comes to mind is like color blindness in terms of contrast. Mm-hmm. So ensuring that we have visual contrast. I think the year was 2006, and I was sitting in lab. I think it was in Building 2, and I was designing this interface, and the question came up. I was like, "Why are you designing in grayscale?" And I've always, for some odd reason, I met a designer years ago, probably like in 2003, and it just stuck with me. But it helps in terms of the visual weighting and ensuring that there's contrast, right? And then you could go ahead and overlay on top of that grayscale with, we have adjustment layers in Photoshop or even in Figma, and so then you could colorize that interface off of that. And so foundationally, I'm just ensuring that I have a good balance in terms of the whole entire user interface that is being presented. And I still do that to this day. It's just something that stuck with me.
I think a lot of game devs have a very similar story like that. Working on Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, when we were designing the user interface, for those who aren't familiar, it's a game that has 4 characters, and you can have up to 4 players playing on, couch co-op, 4 different characters on screen at the same time. And so distinguishing between which character was yours. Yes. When we initially implemented, we had a designer sit in front of it and say, how am I supposed to know which one's mine? We're like, you look at it, because that's yours. Like, no, but they're all the same. They weren't all the same. They were all different colors. Yes. He just could not perceive the different colors. So that's always an important thing to take into account.
And to that point, though, it's tough because we tend to reserve certain colors for user agency, right? So, like in terms of communicating an error versus success, positive, negative affirmation. When we start to introduce other colors, it's like it does become a challenge, but there's tools out there that we utilize. Mm-hmm. And so we're able to run through, there's a 3M visualizer tool. There's also plugins for Figma, Adobe XD that can go ahead and do contrast checking. On top of that, if there's making sure that hierarchy is clear in the user interface, like if you just have a whole bunch of content that is disorganized or not visually grouped, you're not really guiding the user towards where they need to get. And so there's a lot of thought that goes into it. And to touch on accessibility, I know we just talked about color blindness and contrast, but in Madden, we were talking about couch play as well. Communication. So like those that aren't able to be able to talk over microphone, like there's still keyboard or the ability to pull up K-pop and then interface through that. System message, or not system message, but predetermined messaging. So like you see that in mobile, like, congrats, good game, stuff like that. It's just ways to kind of allow for that player to be able to communicate effectively.
One thing that can be taken into account, depending on who your audience is also manual dexterity.
Yes.
So, for example, children have smaller hands, and some people don't have two hands. I think it was even Microsoft, it wasn't too long ago that they admitted like Control-Alt-Delete as a core input, it was a mistake. It was a mistake because someone may have difficulty actually. You need two hands that are spread apart to be able to do that. And yeah, that's just something else to take into account. It's manual dexterity.
But there is a big movement in terms of making sure that we are targeting accessibility. There's also a big push on, or not a big push. It's warranted, but in terms of diversity and inclusion as well. And so the thing is, there's just a lot of conversations that are happening at high level at a lot of gaming companies that we're just trying to go ahead and make sure that the game teams are doing their due diligence to go ahead and make sure that we're accounting for those things.
I would like to also add that one of the things that I experienced when I was working in nuclear power plant setups is that red and green don't always mean good and bad.
True.
And people who are, red green colorblind often can't work in nuclear power plants because red and green mean certain things in those settings. So even in games, sometimes we think of color blindness as this more of okay, cool, we need to work on this for the experience and to have a better experience, but sometimes it's actually a safety critical issue too. So having those types of things taken into account. And then there's a lot of really interesting things related to accessibility where we're seeing that a lot of the things that we think of as accessibility features are actually now going to be the standard, because a lot of people are finding that even though they don't particularly have a disability, they also enjoy that particular feature. So for example, closed captioning. I watch closed captioning on Netflix all the time, even though I'm not hearing impaired. It's mostly because I have a hard time processing audio information. So having closed captions really helps me be able to experience that particular show a little bit better. So. Mm-hmm. All right, so next question is, what are some common mistakes to avoid when designing user interfaces in games?
There's a lot. The thing is attention to detail, right? We see ship titles and we see failures for companies when they release stuff all the time. Mistakes happen. We learn from those failures, right? But punctuation, and copy is critical. If you're showing numbers, actually you have your comma delimited. I mean, stuff like that matters. But on top of that too is just try to not oversaturate the screen with content or overwhelm the user with too much. So in terms of abstracting those concepts and into more digestible chunks, does it warrant being all on one single screen, or can we break that up into a carousel flow? There's so many considerations, right? The other thing we just touched on is contrast, right? We see a lot of UI that gets shared on our social networks, and it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong, aesthetically, spot on. Usability-wise, not so much. And so the thing is, we, as students that go to school or we're learning and wanting to get inspired, we see this and we try to go ahead and actually replicate it, right? But that's only half the battle. You still have to work through a lot of the friction points and the pain points and everything else, and that's important. So,
I want to get your opinion on something.
Yeah.
I have a personal pet peeve with games that use a controller with joysticks and replicate the mouse reticle.
Yeah.
Popular games right now, Destiny 2, the new Hogwarts Legacy game, where there's an actual thing that you're moving around with a joystick. I personally think that's a bad choice. What do you think?
I tend to agree. I mean, because the thing is, from a fidelity perspective, it's kind of annoying, right? And so the thing is, the more frustrated you get playing a game, the less you want to play it, right? And so rather than force that user into a particular mechanic, provide options, right? And so if they can go into their settings and choose some alternative way of navigating. But in terms of the pointer itself, I definitely agree that the fidelity is not there in terms of with controller support. There's some really cool stuff, though, controller-wise, that is just I'm going to go on a tangent here, but when the PS5 came out with the force feedback and the haptics and everything else, that's another thing to touch on accessibility wise. It's not just the user interface or what is being presented on screen. We're talking about the experience as well. How we determine giving feedback through the controller, and so that feedback is critical in certain types of games, right? Mm-hmm. So it's been fun kind of exploring technology and seeing where technology is taking us to make games more immersive and more fun. Yeah, I say fun a lot.
So we're making games, right? It's supposed to be fun.
Exactly.
I would like one game that stands out to me with using that haptic trigger is the Ratchet and Clank, the newest Ratchet and Clank game. Yes. Did such a fantastic job with that. Yeah. Where different zones are, almost each weapon has a completely different haptic zone setup. It's fantastic.
I'm going to go a little bit off script here.
Okay.
So what about like peripherals and other like controllers for like VR? Like how do you feel like that is incorporated into the UI UX experience?
That's like a whole subject matter.
Yeah.
Is input in like extended reality platforms. While at Magic Leap, a lot of the research that we did was with regarding that, and in that research, one of the things that we had to figure out is like what does a UI look like for a game? What does a UI look for? And there's a lot of things that are common that we kind of take for granted in games, like. For example, if you have a game where someone is fighting someone else, they get hit, and then they die. Okay, pretty common setup. You have a player, and most likely, if they're getting hit and then they die, they have a health bar. Okay, the health bar is probably on the top left, usually, or the bottom left, in some corner. It's usually either red or green. When you get hit, it goes down. When it gets to 0, the player dies. Like those are all things that are kind of taken for granted, and that language exists in the world for something like mixed reality, where you are now the character, or you may now be the character. When you're getting hit, like how do you represent that health? I mean, is it an object on the table that is now like a health bar, but you can't guarantee that the player or the user is always going to see that because it's on the table now, and something following you around may feel strange as well. Even simple things like the color red for health. Mm-hmm. Like if it's an object that's red and it's representing your health, that's sort of like blood. And is that too visceral? And does that make people uncomfortable? So it's a difficult question to answer, again, because it's such a huge subject matter.
Yeah, and there's a lot of conversations that do happen around that internally, and there's a lot of debate. I like to joke around that UXR is kind of like the mediator in the group, because it's, if we're based off opinions, we're using actual data to go ahead and justify a decision. And so sometimes, UXR, I couldn't do what I could without research.
All right, so next question is, what are some emerging trends in UI UX design for games, and how can we stay up to date with them?
One trend I have seen a lot is actually getting rid of the UI in hardcore games. It's kind of an immersive mode. There's been games lately that will not show you the player's health and not show you a mini map, and it's coming up more and more often in especially large games now, where you have an open world that you can explore and kind of like allowing the player to feel like they are a part of that world. And I've found that trend to be very interesting, because it's almost the opposite of what games have been trying to do for decades, which is becoming easier and more accessible. I don't know where that's going to head, but it is a trend I am seeing more often now.
Yeah. Let's see here. I've recently kind of come from a gaming experience that's very different than what Alejandro's been working with, in terms of just building more of a conceptual crypto Web3 based game that was all web based. And so when repeat the question one more time for me.
Sure. What are some emerging trends in UI UX design for games, and how can we stay up to date with them?
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's this big concept of like interoperability. I probably screwed that up. But there's this idea of being able to go ahead and have 3D avatars that could be interchangeable and taken from one game to another. There's also talk about, equipment, like if like let's just use Call of Duty as an example, and to be able to take some of their equipment and go ahead and port it over to another title. So I know that there are teams working on that in a sense, and there's been this big push in terms of like what the metaverse is and having your 3D representation that you can go ahead and represent yourself in any game you play. I'm kind of curious as to where that's going to go, but otherwise, I haven't touched on anything too new, innovative as of yet.
So we kind of talked about no UI. And the next question is, how can we design user interfaces to guide players through a game without feeling too intrusive? So obviously that is one option. What about something else that you've seen, like as far as like reducing intrusiveness?
Yeah, so to touch on that from a mobile perspective, we've all played mobile games where when we first sign in, you're presented with a whole bunch of modals or pop-ups, right? And so that's like, hey, welcome back. You've done X, Y, Z, and then like you just kind of get annoyed, right? Rather than doing that, there's ways to where we can, in terms of onboarding and in terms of when the user actually comes back to the experience, it less intrusive, and so intrusive meaning no modals, but to go ahead and actually be able to direct them to a little bit more of like a dashboard or an inbox or something along those lines. We're using more like notifications, so they're just small little identifiers that are on a particular UI, right? But as well, and not the no UI, but we just try to make everything as transparent with still enough contrast so that it doesn't take away from the experience itself. But there's two distinct, there's in-game UI and then there's client side, right? And so the client side tends to be a little bit more branding heavy, a little bit more artistic in a sense, but then the UI in-game is typically just very light because that's what's necessary in order for you to take in everything that's happening while you're playing.
Do you feel like the no UI example popped up more after XR started becoming more popular?
I think so.
Yeah, it was probably around the same time where I think that space was just getting explored, and the Breath of the Wild. I mean, it's been a while already since Breath of the Wild, but that did that, and it did it to great effect, actually.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So next question is, what are some ways to make sure that user interface doesn't interfere with game art style and immersion? So it's kind of along the same lines. But how do you prevent UI UX from interacting with other elements?
So for me, I try to keep UI as neutral as possible, right? And so the thing is we're aiming for cohesiveness, consistency, and so that it makes sense in terms of just the visual language that we have on screen, right? And it's through that where we're kind of ensuring that it just doesn't conflict with in-game artwork, right? And so just it touches on everything that we've kind of talked about in terms of just making sure that contrast is there, that differentiation. But we definitely have that dialogue with the teams as well, and so like when we're conceptualizing and heading through the art direction, we have all open communication channels to kind of ensure that we are not conflicting with one another.
Mm-hmm.
It's also interesting. Like there is a debate going on right now about like whether the UI is part of the game. Like so, the Resident Evil remake just came out, and one of the quality of life improvements that they made was to auto sort your UI, and there's the online debate going on, like, was that a good idea, or is it diluting the experience of having to play Tetris with your items in your inventory? And I mean, I've also seen games where the game is the UI. Specifically, a game from many years ago called Uplink. It's a hacking game, but really the actual gameplay, like the story and the theme is hacking. But the gameplay is like moving things back and moving UI elements back and forth and like optimizing your mouse movements and being able to time things properly in that way. So it's got an intrinsic relationship with the gameplay at every turn.
So almost the opposite of no UI is extra UI.
Exactly.
So it really
Pure
just depends
UI.
on the purpose of your game or the goals
Yeah.
of your game, right? Okay.
Yes, contextually. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. So at this point, I think we're going to take some questions from our YouTube audience and our in-person audience. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
When working with UI UX doesn't work in a bubble, they work with other departments. So my question is, do you have any advice to any other departments that you wish that they knew to make your job easier or any job around them easier?
So the question was, is there anything that you wish non-UX people knew while you're doing the product, what you would want them to know?
Yeah, so anytime in my role, I've always tried to be as collaborative as possible with all other teams. I think having those open channels of communication are important. I also try to take opportunity to educate or mentor and share my knowledge with others so that we could go ahead and work more efficiently, right? So, on the UX side, while I'm focusing on user experience, inside of here, I'm always focusing on like team efficiencies. How could we go ahead and actually do this better? How can we improve upon things? And so it's more of a little bit of a design ops role, right? But having that communication is critical, and just making sure that you're having consistent syncs with the teams, and so that you're not surprising them when you deliver something.
Yeah, I would say also the interesting thing about UI development is it is a true cross-disciplinary, I guess. A true cross-disciplinary development action, because you need art represented and design represented and engineering represented, and really like it's very infrequently that you find one person that can do all those things at top quality. So usually what you end up with is a team of minimum 2 to 3 people. And if it's 2 people, one of those people is cross-discipline themselves, either an artist who understands user experience, or a designer who can do art, or an engineer, or a designer who can implement in code as well. So just based off the nature of the work itself, those considerations are automatically taken into place.
All right. Next question. Yes.
As a digital arts and design student, how big of a leap do you think it is to go from motion graphics to designing UI and UX for games?
Okay, so the question was, how big of a leap is it going from motion graphics to UI, UX design?
I don't think there's a huge leap. With that, I mean, motion graphics is something that's part of my day-to-day as well when I'm creating visual targets. So, and when I say visual targets, it's this concept in terms of this is what we want the end result to look like. But I'm spending a lot of time sometimes just playing around in After Effects just to go ahead and make sure that I am communicating efficiently to other teams, right? Now, there's still composition and art theory and everything else that goes into motion graphics as far as just, how it comes together. And it's the same concept with UI. It's more puzzle pieces, right? We don't really design UI necessarily. Like, the patterns are there, and so there's a drop down is a drop down, an input is an input. And once you become familiar with that stuff, it's more of understanding that there are patterns and that there's precedents, and the innovation happens more so in the UX and how you guide the user through that, and then also through hardware advancements and technological advancements as well. I hope that answered your question. Cool.
All right.
Hello. Oh, I'm sorry. She told me to speak.
You're good.
As a level designer who loves seamless experiences between UI and level design, what are some things I can do in level design that complement in-game UI and support the player experience?
if you have a mini map, don't build multiple levels, multiple layers. Build in 2D. It'll make everything easy.
True. You know what's interesting is like there was one title that I was working on that was Tab Sports Fishing. Unfortunately, the title got sunset because we didn't hit metrics, and that's a harsh reality when we work in games. Is sometimes we work on something for so long that it just never sees the light of day. That said, to your point, like, we had a lot of abstract concepts that we needed to kind of convey in game. Like there was, in terms of leaderboards and PvP concepts. And so we try to get a little too fancy, I think, trying to convey some of those concepts and how we were presenting that to the user. And so I think iterating early, if I were to be able to pair up with that level designer and be able to go ahead and just gray box wireframe and just kind of conceptualize early on, I think we could definitely align closer to versus trying to do it live.
All right, I think we can take a couple online questions.
I was also kind of given the mic here.
Oh, sorry.
Earlier, you touched on player feedback, and in the sea of feedback that you receive, what techniques do you use to prioritize and rank that feedback in terms of what the team should be working on next?
Well, that's a great question. So a lot of the time, in particular for third time, we had community moderators that were going ahead and keeping track of the conversations on Discord. And so what they were doing was going ahead and entering a lot of the issues into the backlog. We would take a look at the frequency for how often those complaints came, and then through play tests, we were going ahead and then being able to identify additional pain points and stuff. And so the thing is, it's what we're capable of actually doing within the given sprint, right? So we work in biweekly sprints. We try to go ahead and allocate a certain amount of time to be able to address bugs or fixes. And so if it's a high enough priority from up above, then we make that happen, and then we try to go ahead and push it out. And that's a nice thing about working on mobile, working on a web-based game is we could go ahead and do real time. When you're working on mobile, you're at the mercy of the App Store, and so sometimes you get delays in terms of when you submit versus when it hits the store. And then for console, it's a completely different, a different ballgame.
All right.
Absolutely.
Do we have anybody else with a mic?
We can do online, Rebecca.
Online? Okay.
One of the questions was, what kind of work would you recommend featuring in a UI designer portfolio?
What kind of work to show in a UI UX portfolio? Gotcha.
So there's been a kind of a change, and I say this mainly just because it's like I've been doing this for about 15 years or so, and so, right now the expectation of a portfolio is to actually show your case studies, kind of explain how you got to your end result, to be able to go ahead and share some of the work that landed to that end result. But on top of that, I think it's good to kind of summarize if it launched, like how that kind of helped conversions and help certain metrics or KPIs for the business. We're starting to see a lot more of that in terms of the portfolios that came across my desk. But the thing is, it's like we're redefining this position of UI UX as we move along. 10 years ago, UX wasn't part of the conversation. We just designed user interfaces. And so the thing is not to say that UX isn't important. It just really wasn't as prioritized. And so now we're kind of redefining our roles and what we're able to contribute and how we're able to kind of make more informed decisions to create better experiences.
All right.
Another one is, where does Figma fit into all of this?
Where does Figma fit into all of this?
If I'm sorry, Adobe, but like in Figma is acquired by Adobe. But like I was big on Adobe XD for a long time, and then eventually I started hearing about Figma, and I love Figma. Figma has changed my life in so many ways because I'm able to build more one-to-one with how we're actually the engineers are building. So in terms of like auto layout and how it translates to Flexbox, it's just an easier handoff to engineering, right? Be able to facilitate communication with other teams, and so there's Figma and FigJam, you know, this endless whiteboard. Some of you might be familiar with Miro. So to have that whole entire ecosystem where you're able to you know, pay for a starter business package or enterprise package and have everybody on your team have access to that stuff is critical. And has really changed the way I work over the past year and a half or two. And there's new things coming out with Figma that are just insane, and I can't wait to play.
I would like to add that tools change over time.
Yes.
So right now, Figma, we just did a survey of tools, and I can't remember what the organization is off the top of my head, but Figma was one of the it was the top 1 or 2 tools for UI UX design right now. But we do also have Adobe XD, which just acquired Figma. So that might morph into a new product or, you know, something that we might not have right at the moment. So.
Yeah. And I just want to touch on that really quick. Don't just learn Figma. Like, play around with all the tools, because the thing is, the more familiar you get, you might land a role in an organization that doesn't use the tools that you prefer. And so the thing is, the more nimble and flexible you are, the better. So just familiarize yourself, and don't paint yourself in a corner to where you're only a one program person.
All right.
Hi. I was told to speak, but is it difficult to transition from a UI on display on, you know, PC or console to a VR UI display?
I think you could do a one-to-one, right? And so you could take that in UI and just go ahead and just mount it onto a plane and call it done. But to make it intentional and to align with that sort of experience, I think there's a lot of work to kind of deconstruct or reverse engineer that PC UI, and then start exploring through different interactions to be able to kind of land on the same results.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the what we talked about earlier, which is like understanding the user experience of that specific platform and designing the user interface for that. And yeah, a plane that's locked to your face is usually not the best user experience in VR.
All right. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
I'm just curious how you think that design philosophies across platforms like PC and console will differ, and how allowing the player to interact with the UI is going to have to change.
For me, it always comes down to the distinction, specifically with PC and console, it always comes down to the distinction of, is the player leaning forward or are they leaning back? So when you're on your PC, you're hunched over and you're laser focused into the monitor. When you're on your console, you're typically in your chair, maybe your legs are up, you've got the thing, you may a big screen in front of you, and so that definitely should inform how your UI. I mean, it comes that we mentioned before the mouse controller on a joystick. Again, it's not. In my opinion, it's not a super great choice. It doesn't feel great as a user. So that's one of the things that I think about is the player leaning forward or are they leaning back when they're experiencing this?
I hadn't thought of it like that, but that's going to stay with me. Yeah, that's the thing, though. To every platform is unique, and so the thing is, I think it's important to do your due diligence and understand what you're building for, and then have those tough conversations to see if can you port it one-to-one, or do you need to go ahead and actually analyze a custom UI UX for each experience. Typically, the latter's the best route, but it just depends on expectations and time box and deadlines.
I would also add that with UI UX, a lot of times you want to kind of use the mental model that people already have about that experience in order to make sure that it's a little bit more intuitive. So, for example, in VR, usually it's a little bit easier to go the like low UI or no UI route because that's how we experience the world. Unless there is a reason not to. So for example, if you're turning on a light, typically we don't do something like turn a bicycle wheel in order to turn on a light. But if you're in some kind of like steampunk setting, you might use a crank in order to turn on a light. So there's a reason for that. You don't just want to add things just because you can sometimes.
All right, and we have one last question.
All right, this was kind of like a 2-in-1 scenario question. First was just like a sum up of where you were talking about like mixing games with the game art system with UI systems. Would that basically kind of be like cooperative in like a co-op scenario where you can just have like making the UI coming into like a game art scenario?
I'm trying to break down the question. So we're talking about in-game UI, correct?
Mm.
And in terms of the actual game art itself, so like let's use Madden for example, right? So on field, you have the player reticles that are underneath their feet, and if the X Factor, their special team, gets utilized, and then that is done in game in terms of like some of those effects that are generated, right? But then we could support that with screen overlays or something like that for that feedback to convey that this particular ability has been triggered, or if there's a cooldown associated with it. There's a marriage of the two.
Because for example, I thought like the scenario was like, say if UI and UX like introducing like their tutorial for like the colorblind scenario and trying to kind of wave all your questions into one with the art scenario. That's kind of what I meant.
Okay.
Have you done accessibility tutorials in your game?
No, unfortunately, I haven't. In terms of my experience, I think it's really, it's tough. It depends on the context of what's trying to be conveyed, right? True. And so the thing is, sometimes that the visual can't really deliver, and so then you need that supportive text to get that point across. And we see it a lot of the times, and that's why I was talking about the marriage of being supporting with like an overlay graphic or something like that, just because you need that additional context sometimes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And I would say to add to that, usually trying to use as few words as possible usually is a little bit better. And that's when we go back to that mental model we were talking about, whatever is closest to what you would imagine if you were interacting with it in real life. All right. Thank you all for attending, and we will be having another Tech Tuesday next week. And I just want to say thank you to the audience here, to our panelists, and then also to our audience online.